Hi, everyone. I'd like to begin this event by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship with Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Passamaquoddy peoples. They first signed with the British Crown in 1726. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules for what is to become an ongoing relationship between nations. Welcome to today's event. It is open to everyone and is also the keynote address for the DHSI East, the Digital Humanities Summer Institute East, where we have brought participants from varied geographic regions and disciplines to an intense 4-day workshop on how digital tools can help us undertake humanities teaching, research, and knowledge dissemination. For those of us attending workshops, if you would like to discuss carpooling back to Halifax, especially we're looking for people who can carpool on Friday morning, please meet over to your left after the talk. Okay, yes. You're right. Yes, that's my right hand. Okay, afterwards, and hopefully we can find some carpooling options for people, again, especially Friday morning. So, if you didn't already know, my name is Margaret Vale, and I'm a librarian here at St. FX. And what else am I supposed to say about myself? Oh, nothing. But I'd also like to reintroduce Laura Estel and Abby Ives, who have been my co-organizers on this incredible event, which it seems like everybody is really enjoying, because I've heard that you haven't even been necessarily leaving very long to eat your snacks. I also would like to thank the Government of Canada because this event has been funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, as well as the St. FX Research Office. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Stacy Allison-Cassin. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Information Science at Dalhousie University. Her research examines equitable metadata and knowledge organization practices, particularly in the relation to Indigenous knowledge and peoples. She is the chair of the Teaching and Learning Community for, is it NICLA? I forgot to ask ahead of time, for NICLA, which stands for the National Indigenous Knowledge and Language Alliance. Today, her talk will be on reflections on ethics and justice in the age of metadata. I'm going to say that again, sorry. Reflections on ethics and justice in metadata in the age of AI. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stacy Allison-Cassin.
All right, I think my mic is on. It's making noise when I'm moving it around, so that's, let's see. Get that on. Oh, I think it's going. Great. Thanks, Margaret, for that introduction. And I just want to take a moment to thank Margaret and Laura and Abby for organizing this event and inviting me to speak today. I've got to remember I actually have a clicker. I don't normally use one, so I'm probably going to gravitate back to the podium constantly. And I'll try not to do that. So you already heard my talk, which has maybe too many ins, I was realizing. And I think it's also one of those things when you're setting a title ahead of time. I don't know if this happened to you ever, where you're like, oh, I'll come up with this sort of generous title that hopefully will work in a number of months. And so, you know, it is this generous title. I'm going to try and pack some different things into it today. I want to start off by just elaborating a little bit more. Come over here. A little bit more about myself. So thank you, Margaret, for that introduction. But just a little bit more to let you know who I am, maybe why I do some of the work that I do. So I was born in Thunder Bay. I know there's at least, anybody here from Thunder Bay? Yeah. I knew there was one. So yay, Northern Ontario, but I grew up in Winnipeg, so any prairie people here, yay for prairies. And then my family moved to the Toronto area when I was 12. You know, I went to Laurier, and I know there's at least one Laurier grad here, yay! and then I did a year at UVic, yay! But I was like, I'm on an island, why am I on an island? So I was studying music performance. If you haven't heard that about me, I played the French horn, and I'm like, why am I on an island with this? You know, I thought it would be easier to get to Vancouver, which is, of course, very silly of me. And then I went to U of T. I'm sure there's some people here, yay, went to U of T. And this is like, now I've started this whole journey, I'm gonna have to keep going. And then I went down to Duquesne University in Pennsylvania. Yeah, really? I was like, no one, really? Wow, oh, I'm so excited. So that like never happens, yay, Duquesne. Because I'd never heard of it before I went there. So I did a music master's at Duquesne University. Partway through that, I was like, what am I doing with my life? I had one of those, is this what I want to do kind of moments. And I think I already told this story to someone this week, but I was doing some research. I don't know, some project, I don't really remember what it was, and I couldn't find this resource. And someone helped me, and I was like, how did you know where this was? And they were like, I am a music librarian. And I was like, what? That's a thing? So I was like, that's what I want to do, I think, with this, you know, I've got like how many years of performance? And so I went and did an information studies master's degree at U of T. Yay, U of T again. It's like back to Toronto. And after that, I had my first job was at the Canadian Music Centre, which is in Toronto, and then from there to York University. So I know that was a very long timeline. I'm sure you can repeat it all back to me. But just to say, I kind of had this varied educational path, eventually doing a PhD at York. But I was a librarian for 19 years, mostly at York University, where I was a music cataloger, actually then briefly a digital humanities librarian, then a digital pedagogy librarian, but always had developed a really strong interest in metadata and really thinking about how we organize, how things mean, and how we can do things better. I recently joined DAL, I think in July. Yay, DAL! In July 2022, after a brief stint at U of T again. And I was really delighted to move into teaching and researching in information. So that's one part of my story. The other part, just to give you some background, also, so my mom's family came to Canada from Ireland, Scotland, Germany. Actually, my grandmother's from St. John, and my grandfather's from Quebec, but they both lived in Thunder Bay. And my dad's family, my grandfather from Miramichi, they came from Ireland, and my dad's mom was Métis, so French fur traders and First Nations foremothers, really active in the Upper Great Lakes out through sort of Red River area, all sort of moving around through on the trade routes. So that's now I'm sure you've got my whole biographical story, but I really like this idea that we're kind of all made of stories, right? We're all sort of coming from all of these things that go together to make us sort of who we are, but also what we're interested in doing. And then I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge and express my gratitude to, you know, everyone, I mean, all of you, really. Thank you, everyone here today. I know that many of you are at the workshops. We've had conversations. And we know that when we meet people and talk and work with people, that really just adds to our own knowledge and understanding. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. And we already heard some acknowledgement of the First Peoples, so the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, Passamaquoddy, whose lands we're on, and I have a lot of gratitude that I am here in beautiful Mi'kma'ki and get to experience a lot of hikes and being out in nature. So that's something I want to just make sure that I acknowledge. So today, introduction and conclusion, and then two sort of main things that I want to talk about. My very favorite topic, of course, which is a structured vocabulary, and then some time on AI and impacts on describing culture material. I feel like it's so cliched that I have AI in the title, but I've resisted for so long in some ways just saying AI, because we know that that means many, many different things. However, I do feel like I'm at this point, I'm like, what now? So I want to talk about that a little bit. So in thinking about this talk today, as I just mentioned, really feeling in some ways for me like we're on the sort of cusp of maybe having to think differently about things that we've been doing for really quite a long time. And it's not to say that computational methods are new or that artificial intelligence is new. I'm sure many of you have been investigating or know of these things already. And I'm really interested in having a conversation, so I'm going to try and leave some time also for questions or conversations that we can have at the end. And I was just, this 2025 AI Index report was just released recently. And I think it's, we've been hearing AI is going to change the world, it's transformative, it's a threat, it's all of these things. But I think for me, what I'm interested in talking a little bit today about is this idea of uneven distribution, but also what we can do about that, or that it's not necessarily all terrible and bad. That's not the tack I'm trying to take in this talk. And I'm sure, again, this is the right crowd to say, critical approaches to AI, or critical approaches to, there are already critical approaches to software, critical approaches to technology. I think we know, many of us in this room know how to do this well. And it's not like this has gone away, right? It's still really needed, and really needed in a way that also meets what I might call the public, or like in sort of beyond the academy. And so I'm going to talk right now about naming injustice. And again, I don't think I need to tell many of you how important naming and terminology is. I think that's a really fundamental part of humanities work, to think very deeply about what it means to name and to categorize, and thinking about language. I think that it's just such an important part of what we do. And I was just in John's database class for the last, we were talking about like, what do you choose? How do you think about even saying things about gender, or making choices when we call or name a table, right? That has, even if it's in the background, it has a kind of ideological bend to it that says something about the system you're creating. And so we know that systems have these ideologies inside them. We work all the time in language that has a particular ideology. And I just really think that what can we do in these spaces to make that visible, to make that transparent, but also how do we address that or think about that? Hope Olson, this book, Power to Name, is from 2016. And I still think, actually, I think it was earlier than 2016. I'm trying to remember when the first edition was, because I think that's not the right date. It's a really amazing book that I still think a lot about, what she says. And of course, I'm of library orientation, so I am going to talk today about libraries. But libraries, like so many, like the university, like a museum or an archive, reflect the marginalizations that are in broader society. They are part of reflecting back, or not even just reflecting, they are forming culture. And so libraries play a major role in perpetuating sort of exclusion, of showing what's important, of documenting communities in particular ways. Again, this is probably not necessarily new to many of you in the room, but I think it is critical that we think about what this means for us. And because, things are going along, and then all of a sudden it felt like, wait a second here. You might have heard about these executive orders that are coming out of the White House, first in a great flood of them, and that they actually do impact libraries, and I'm sure you've heard about the impacts on the Smithsonian museums, the IMLS grants, the humanities grants, so really starts to have far-reaching impacts on culture. And what I wanted to mention before is, we're at a place in a lot of ways that there have been changes happening to what seemed like a really static institution. So one of the things you might have heard on what was the very first day was the change of Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America, and Mount Denali back to Mount McKinley. And so I know we talked about mark in our workshop, so here's a little bit of mark coding for you. This is what it looks like. This is a snapshot of when this change was released in February 2025. So libraries use Library of Congress subject headings very widely in North America. That's a controlled vocabulary that helps us choose the right word, the preferred word we're going to use to document something. If you want to know a little bit about mark, the preferred term is way up there at the top. You can see 151, so that's the preferred term, and then you see all these 451s. These are the sort of like the alias, the other terms. And it says up there, change heading. So this had a huge impact, actually. This one wasn't just changing maps. It's not just changing, we got to change, or certain media shouldn't use Gulf of Mexico in their publications. Every library was instructed to change that term. Now, there was a letter that came out from the Subject Analysis Committee of the American Library Association that was like, you can't do this, this goes against policy, this is not the way we usually change terms. But this thing at the bottom here in particular, changing Mount Denali isn't just, again, this label that we put over things. It actually says something to Indigenous peoples in North America. It says, you're not important, it's disrespectful, it is reversing sort of a return to the original name of Mount Denali. And the Library of Congress had actually been working to make substantive changes to their headings, creating opportunities for Indigenous folks to have positions within the Library of Congress to do this work, and now this is just all overridden. And I went in because I was curious. So I was just picked on Dal a little bit. So Dalhousie University catalog, this is just from today. And we can see that it has, for a recent book, it says Gulf of America there. So this isn't just something that happens to the United States. Because we have standards, because we have ways of interchanging data, which is all good, it does have this impact that when a change is made to the Library of Congress, this ripple effect where that goes out to all the libraries. Not necessarily because libraries want to make those changes. There are issues like resources. We know that that's a problem of if you're going to, so this might be all something you recognize too as people who work in the digital realm. There's an issue of how are you going to maintain if you fork your system from the sort of main system, you are then responsible for maintaining that local heading. So a lot of libraries don't necessarily have the resources to maintain, update headings at the local level. There's definitely a lot now where of a situation where libraries are uploading mass amounts of there's not so much handwork cataloging anymore. And so if you're uploading a big set of, 500 volumes of ebooks or something, you're not necessarily going to change that heading. Maybe if you had Open Refine. I don't But there's a cost of maintaining systems that makes it challenging to potentially keep up with these kinds of changes. But that is not necessarily excusing this kind of situation. But what I'm trying to illustrate is this decision in the United States, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with libraries, has this trickle effect that actually impacts libraries, academic libraries here in Nova Scotia, potentially public, I haven't looked, but potentially public libraries in Nova Scotia. I'm putting the clicker at the wrong place. So that is definitely an issue when we think about controlled vocabulary. I know that not everyone here is cataloging in libraries, but controlled vocabularies have an impact on how we sort of meet the world, especially when it comes to accessing resources like research or, let's say, picture books at the local public library. Now, an example also of kinds of things that you might not necessarily think about as being obvious when we work with structured data is, so this is an example from Wikidata. I think you did some work with Wikidata this week. It's this problem of what I like to call a same as problem. I know we talked a little bit about same as issues in the database class, maybe also in the workshop, other workshop. But that's where you say, this term is the same as this term, so we can link them, or we say that they're equivalent. So this is an issue where the label seems fine, Métis seems okay, but the label says it's people of mixed ancestry, which is not the way that Métis is defined by Métis associations such as the Manitoba Métis Federation or the Métis National Council. And then we see another problem, it's sort of way down at the bottom, I don't know if you can see it, where it's saying this is instance of an ethnic group. And there is some argument that maybe ethnic group isn't the correct kind of situating of an indigenous nation. That's a nation, not necessarily an ethnic group. You see a similar issue with the use of Métis in the Library of Congress. I keep hoping they update it. They've not updated this particular heading, which also says mixed. Also because they've checked this by calling the Bureau of Indian Affairs at some point. And you can, again, some mark coding, just in case you're wondering. But you can read that in these authority records, which is where this comes from, they actually record sort of where they did their research. Where did it come from? How do we understand this term? And so you can get a sense of how do we situate this term. So both of these terms, if you were going to use a controlled vocabulary, look fine, but the underlying concepts or definitions are really problematic. So if you're going to, in your project, potentially draw on or connect to a resource that has headings like this, what do we do when those same as issues are actually not the same, or potentially are problematic or harmful when they're used? So again, I know that all of you are not libraries, you're not librarians, you're not necessarily cataloging, but these kinds of terminologies can be used in systems like Omeka or like digital projects, where you might say, I would like to use a controlled vocabulary. So how do we understand the situation of those terms? On the other hand, vocabularies, ontologies, and thesauri create opportunities. So those were some examples of problematic terms. This is known for a long time, for example, that Library of Congress is problematic. This is not news. On the flip side, we have the opportunity to think about structured data, vocabularies, thesauri, as opportunities for justice. So this is an example of an advisory note. Maybe you've seen advisory notes before. If you do any historical research, they're like, we know there's issues here, just be forewarned that. So that's Library of Congress. I know that Canadiana or CRKN has similar notes. So you might encounter these as sort of a first opportunity to say something's going on here. Another example from the Government of Canada is actually the Geographical Names Board. So one of the problems with the Gulf of America example is that the Library of Congress is required to do whatever happens with the Geographical Name Board in the United States. I can't remember their title, but they're kind of required to, whatever happens there gets reflected in the Library of Congress. So we have a similar organization in Canada, the Geographic Names Board of Canada, and they've been doing a lot of work to look at ways of returning of names, supporting ways that Indigenous nations can go back to original names, understanding that there might be multiple names for the same geographic entity. So here, this screenshot example is a river. And I think it's a good question for digital projects, right? What do we do about naming something in a resource? Or how do we have multiple namings? Instead of that original example I showed where there was a push towards choosing one, you have to have one name for everything. And I know we talked about it, I'm looking at John, because we talked about this in the database. Like, you don't necessarily, it's not true that everything has, it's not reality that something, maybe a person is gonna have one name forever, or something has one name forever. Things change. And so are we creating systems that are generous or open to those changes? And also hooking into potential or supporting the kinds of things we see around us, where organizations are supporting this kind of work. And some of this work we can think of as being reparative or work that is reconciliation, because this work is grounded in changing existing systems. So these systems are probably colonial in nature. They are at their roots. There's probably, maybe we wouldn't do it this way if we're starting now, but this push to trying to change what's there is a form of repair or reconciliation. Again, this is not necessarily new. The Maori subject headings have been around for quite some time. Again, thinking about how multiple ways of knowing can be supported in database systems. Now, another path, and so if we go back here, this is changing something that exists. This is like, we're not necessarily changing anything. We're just putting a label on here to let you know that there's some bad stuff here. This is changing or trying to change what's existing. And I think of some of the next couple projects I'm going to talk about as being projects that are really the idea of ethics, the idea of thinking about things in a just way are sort of foundational to the projects themselves. That's like baked in. It's part of how the projects are going to work. And so I think it's good to recognize, I think, those different kinds of approaches. So where do you need to change something that exists? And if you're building new, how do you think about ways to do that that are bringing these things together? So I think, do some folks here know the Homosaurus? I feel like probably yes, of course you do. So awesome project, really community-oriented around linked data, yay, and LGBTQ plus vocabulary, yay. So bringing those things, those together and creating, it's a huge project, I feel like at this point, and allows for alternate vocabularies that says don't even try and change something like, I mean, you could still change Library of Congress, but maybe don't worry about it too much because we have this whole other thing over here that is created by people from the community, that is community supported, that is going to give you the kind of the way that you should be doing things. So you can add that in as well. And so a lot of libraries are using these terms. It's available to use, again, supporting projects that are doing this community-led work. So thinking about community-led strategies. This is another example from Hawaii where they have a Mellon grant to really think carefully and deeply about creating not just the terms, but just the way of thinking through how do we structure this data? How are we, I think I said that earlier, so I love data modeling. So how do you think about structuring that data right from the beginning in a way that isn't going to be, oh, we're just going to do something alphabetical, or we're going to take a subject approach, where we're really thinking about how is a worldview represented in the data model. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about a project that I'm involved in, which is the Respectful Terminology Platform Project. We received a Mellon grant, I think about a year and a half ago. And this project is the same, actually quite similar to the project from Hawaii in that it's really trying to say, rather than changing existing terms, what do we do if we do it right from the beginning to try and think about what it means to reflect respect in that from the beginning. And also to create, I know that some of you have heard us talk about this before, but for those who haven't, the idea is to create a system that will not only have the vocabulary, but have the infrastructure to support community-led practices in the creation of structured vocabularies or terminology, hopefully linked data. So that is the way that we're approaching our work, and a lot of gratitude to my co-lead, Allison-Cassin, who's at the University of Fraser Valley, in doing this work together, and really spending some time in thinking about it. So this is we had our foundational gathering just over a year ago, and really bringing together, I don't think anybody's here from, maybe they were here earlier this week in Wolfville, some folks, but really bringing people together to say, how do we do this from scratch, right from the beginning, where we're really thinking about having community control over terms. So not so something is going to be established and then it sits there static forever and ever, or that we have community control. Should this term be available? Should this set of terminologies be available? And not only that, but thinking about ways to create systems to support communities that might not have enough resources to necessarily create structured vocabulary on their own. Because I think that's sometimes a hard part. There might be a great set of vocabulary somewhere, but maybe it's in, a spreadsheet. Has everyone been seeing lots of spreadsheets this week so far? So it's probably in a spreadsheet somewhere. So that's great, but how do we take that spreadsheet and maybe have a workflow that can bring that spreadsheet into something that is more usable for the organization, but also potentially offers that data to to others that might need it, if that follows the particular protocol. Because oftentimes, I think for small organizations, your stuff, maybe for your projects, it gets kind of stuck, right? It's hard to push out. So how can we do that? So again, I think it's a lot of opportunities for thinking about how we can, I know I said an AI, and how we can, because I think structured data is good for AI, right? It's good for some of those machine processing. So how can we actually improve the quality, the community-supported, structured data available? That can only be good. And so how do we find pathways to do that? how do we look out to other community projects that are working on things like vocabulary and use them in our own projects? A couple other quick shout outs to National Library of Wales, which is making their authority data. So you saw that Mount Denali authority record I showed you, or the Métis. They're making that available, as is the National Library of Germany. Just to say, we've got this really rich data. Maybe there's some problems in it, but also maybe you can use that data. So, oh, I didn't start my timer. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is description. So to me, this is the stuff, so we have what stuff is about. We might use structured data for that. And then there's how we describe collections or how we describe materials in a digital humanities project. Maybe you did some of that this week. I'm looking at contact. You know, how are we describing this thing? In libraries and archives, we use standards, approaches to how we do that. Thinking about like, and I've been thinking lately about, you know, there's these different ways that we do this that have been around really for, I don't know, rules for cataloging since maybe 1880. And they have a lot to do with where you record information from, what's important in a resource, where you put a period and a semicolon, and how many, it used to be how many subject headings you could, I used to, you could only add 3 subject headings when I first started cataloging. Does anybody have any thoughts about why there might be 3 subject headings? Yeah. Card catalogs. There's only so much room on an index card, even if we've been using computers for a long time. So computer systems, but still really ruled by the card catalog. And I've been thinking a lot about, well, what does this mean in this time when maybe, like, does it even matter what we do anymore in some ways? Because a lot of practice that we use in describing resources is really based on ideas of efficiency. So, you know, libraries and archives, museums I always think about as they're kind of a bit different, but they're really always been part, like technology's always been part of that. The typewriter's always been part of it, the furniture of the card catalog, these systems that are focused on efficiency, which isn't necessarily the best way to approach doing description. And that efficiency has always been a driver of why we do things the way we do in libraries. And I know I'm talking about libraries a lot, but to me they are very closely allied with the way that we think also of digital humanities projects. Because that practice of thinking about how we describe resources. And lately I've been like, what am I even doing anymore? Like, what is this thing? Because I teach, I know there's some students here, I teach like organizing information, and next year I'm teaching cataloging. I'm like, but computer AI systems, do I teach people where to put the periods and the things anymore? Or are we done with that? I'm really at this point, and if anybody wants to help me out at this quandary, I'm happy to hear, of saying, but are the machines just gonna do that for us now? Like, do we do it? Because there is a huge push. And none of this is new. AI is not new. As I said, computational methodologies have been used in digital humanities certainly for a long time. It's not necessarily new, but it does feel like we're getting to a point where this is now becoming part of everyday workflows, part of everyday work. And that, I think, is a little bit different. So the Library of Congress has been doing some experimentation with doing automated metadata creation with things that might be yay, or that might be like, oh, what? Apparently it hasn't gone super well. So shocking. But they're pushing, they're pushing on, and they're doing, they're investing and figuring out like how would this work? Where are the opportunities where AI might be useful? And I'm not saying we're going to get rid of all the humans. I think we already did get rid of most of the humans in cataloging, frankly. But it is about trying to figure out what can machine processing help with, where is it not very good. And so Library of Congress is doing this. This is the part where I get a little bit like, what? I don't know. So vendors are now saying, hey, we can just AI everything and it'll be great. Okay, so you're starting with language. You can see how there might be processing to start with language. Summaries, maybe you've all tried using AI to do summarizing articles already. Somebody tried that? It works. Yeah, it works okay, maybe? No. So that's what that is. Can we use AI to summarize resources and to apply subject headings? So this is the part where I'm like, but what and how and what do we do now? Would we teach this? Do we not teach this? So I'm really feeling like we're at this point of like, what does this mean for describing resources, for metadata, for thinking about human-created metadata? I'm not saying no machines can ever do anything ever with metadata, because they already are. But what are the implications in some of our cultural heritage sectors? What does it mean for the kind of work that you are all doing? What about databases in general? And what about these handcrafted databases that we like to create? Like, what does that mean at scale? Or what does that mean? So I just have a lot of questions, I feel like, right now in the last couple years about what does this mean for something that felt relatively, even I'm going to go back to this, felt relatively stable in some ways. Like maybe we were using computers, but we had this practice that was all about, you take this as information and you record this stuff. But if we're not doing that anymore, what does that mean? I actually just like, what does that mean? How is this going to go? And what do we, it's always the, what do we gain? What do we lose? And what are the implications for the sort of wider, for humanities or for arts or for cultural knowledge in general? I had to work some Kittler into this talk somehow. So it just, again, these thinking about what does it mean for things to kind of be absorbed into sort of the black boxes of the machine, to just have this stream of data seems to have no connection to humans. And so I think that to me is an open question. And also, what do we offer in this space? So not just people working in libraries or thinking about libraries, but what do people who, again, going back to that idea of having critical thinking about data structures and about meaning and language, what can we offer or what can we do? Maybe some of you are already doing. I'm always like, well, you've got to support structured data on the web. That's always a good thing. But something I've noted lately, maybe you've seen this as well, but projects that are thinking about conceptualizing and classifying harm in AI as building frameworks or structures that help us understand what AI can do. So there is this AI taxonomy that categorizes, this is a harm to property, this is a harm to human rights. And thinking about these harms and logging them either before an AI, let's say a large language model is released or after, helps to build up knowledge about harms, but also I'm really kind of interested in the frameworks for classifying and conceptualizing what this means. Again, thinking about our sort of critical approaches to these questions. Another space, again, perhaps this is something you're already working on, but thinking about governance as a really critical place where knowing something about, well, what happens if we do something? How is this impacting people? How is this impacting the resources? Where are the sort of downstream impacts of a decision that's made for something as simple as, well, we're going to summarize what a book is about in a library catalog. Maybe that seems small, but if we think about all those daily places where AI might be used, how do we think about conceptualizing both sort of what could be beneficial, but also where some of those harms might be, and then thinking about impacts on governance, because that's where it also really meets sort of the everyday person, the everyday impacts on government. And I think that's something all of us could have a role in, if not already, in thinking about AI. Particularly around issues of transparency and trustworthiness, as, to go back to, I mean, Kittler is not new, again, but this idea of like, well, what's happening in that black box? It's invisible. We don't know how to think about it if it's not transparent. And can we trust it? So this AI report that just came out said that, I think it was like 40% of Canadians don't trust AI. So it's not like people have like, woohoo, AI feelings already. So what does that also mean if we can't trust particular systems? Or how do we think about that issue of trust? So how can we assist? What can we do about governance? How do we think about community considerations? So going back to those projects like the Homosaurus that are really focused in on community collaborations. And I just wanted to close with this idea that, and it's really important because of course we're all connected. So I like this idea also of our epistemic lives. We are connected. What we do has impacts on others. How can we use our knowledge, our critical approaches to thinking deeply about things like language, about how things operate, how systems function? How do we create projects that actually are thinking potentially about the sort of interesting uses of AI and supporting each other's projects as well? So I think that's another piece that's really important. So with that, I don't know if you can see this little sticky note says I used to have a printout of this above my desk because it says it's tough, but it can be done. Because there's always like, no, that's impossible. I'm like, is it impossible or is it just really, really hard and maybe we won't do it? But I like to think that it's tough, but it can be done. So how can we think about ways that we can support community work that's happening already to improve equity and justice on the web, in AI systems, think about interventions into policy, and again, maybe also finding pathways for supporting each other in the kinds of work that you're doing that might be also thinking deeply about equity and justice. And with that, thanks.
Thank you so much, Stacy. What a wonderful talk. As a librarian, I already agree with you 100% that this information is very important, but I'm also thrilled that you were able to share it with everyone in this digital humanities community and make it relevant for everyone here. We are going to take questions now. The questions will not be filmed. The Q&A session is not going to be recorded. And I'm going to hand the microphone over to Abby, who's going to bring you the microphone so that everyone can hear your question.